Okay, I think we're going to get started now. I want to welcome all of you to the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs book event. And today we're going to hear from Vincent Ialenti about his book, Deep Time Reckoning. What I want to do first is a little bit of housekeeping, and that's to let you guys know that this is being recorded, and we will be taking questions in the Q&A. So please, if you have questions as Vincent talks, please put them in the Q&A box, and I will be the interpreter of those questions. So that's the housekeeping. So let me start off then with a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge that though we are meeting virtually, we are meeting on the land on which we gather on the land on which the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'm Allison Macfarlane, by the way. I'm the director of the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs here at UBC. And my area of specialization is on nuclear issues and nuclear waste in particular. So this topic is very near and dear to my heart. And I thought I would introduce Vincent by talking a little bit about nuclear waste disposal, and in particular, sort of orienting us. I know that right now we are all focused very much on the coronavirus, which is again rising in numbers and sweeping everything. But there is good news on the horizon. There's yet another vaccine that's announced that it seems to be quite effective. And so hopefully, I'm hopeful that a year from now, we will be having these meetings in person and not virtually. And that we will begin to switch to focus on other urgent issues of our time as well. Things like climate change. And as we do such switching and expanding our focus, I'm hopeful that we'll be considering things about energy resources and the energy sources that don't produce carbon dioxide. Of course, nuclear power is one of those energy sources that doesn't produce carbon dioxide, but it does have its own set of unique problems. And one of those problems is what to do with the highly radioactive nuclear waste that is produced from nuclear power. One of the countries that's actually most advanced in dealing with nuclear waste is Finland, and Finland is the focus of Vincent's book. Finland is actually actively constructing a repository for its high-level nuclear waste, its spent nuclear fuel from its nuclear power plants. And in fact, the globally agreed upon path, the best way of managing this kind of material is to put it deeply underground, more than 400 meters underground, and therefore remove it from the human environment and the natural environment. Some of the people tasked with helping to carry out such a policy of putting this material deep underground are geologists. And actually, I am one of them. I am a geologist myself. And I think one thing that Vincent focuses on in his book is the deep time mindset of geologists. When you become a geologist, you are inculcated in deep time. So for me, 1 million years is nothing. It's like a second. 10 or 20 million years are still pretty short periods of time, because you have to put it in the context as a geologist of Earth, and the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. So we think differently about time. Of course, nuclear waste is radioactive for a long time, and therefore it needs to be isolated from the environment and from humans for a long time. Some countries require the waste to be isolated for 10,000 years, other countries up to 1 million years. Both are periods of time that for non-geologists, they're difficult to conceptualize. So people might think, well, society exists 10,000 years from now, or a million years from now? Well, will humans exist then? Will we have evolved to something else? Because after all, humanoids have not been around for more than a couple million years. So Vincent has taken a deep look at Finland's experience in nuclear waste disposal, and he's going to share with us some of the insights that he gained from his analysis looking at Finland's experiences and their experiences in thinking about deep time. So he's going to talk with us about his book, Deep Time Reckoning. Vincent's currently a postdoctoral fellow here at University of British Columbia in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. Previously, he was a research professor at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs in Washington, D.C. Vincent holds a PhD in anthropology from Cornell University, and I am now going to turn things over to Vincent. Over to you.
All right, well, thank you, Allison, for this kind, generous, thought-provoking introduction. And I'd like to quickly thank Simon Nicholson, Sakina Jinnah, Beth Clevenger, Judy Feldman, everyone at MIT Press for their wonderful work in helping make this book a reality. It's very exciting. Grateful to Lindsay Marsh at UBC's School of Public Policy and Global Affairs for setting up this event. And of course, thanks to everyone who's here, wherever here may be for you, for showing up. So from 2012 to 2014, I spent 32 months conducting anthropological fieldwork among Finland's nuclear energy and waste experts. I recorded over 120 interviews with geologists, managers, chemists, physicists, lawyers, engineers, politicians, regulators, activists, banking professionals, and members of the public in Finland. My interest was in the everyday work lives of Finland's uniquely long-sighted nuclear waste repository safety case experts. These experts developed models of geological, hydrological, and ecological events that could occur in Western Finland over the coming tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years. Safety case experts routinely reckoned with distant future glaciations, climate changes, earthquakes, floods, human and animal population changes, and more. Their goal was to develop a portfolio of technical evidence supporting Finland's nuclear industry's license application for a government permit to begin formal construction of this repository. The repository will be located about 450 meters underground on the island of Olkiluoto in the Gulf of Bothnia in the Baltic Sea. Finland's nuclear regulatory authority STUK approved the safety case in 2015 for the construction license phase. Soon after, Finland's Ministry of Employment and the Economy issued the Finnish nuclear waste management company Posiva a construction license. This made Finland the first country in the world to get to the stage of licensing a spent nuclear fuel repository. Sometime in the next few years, the Olkiluoto repository will very likely begin accepting waste. Now, critical social scientists like me have usually been quick to sort of brush off these long-term safety assessment models in the safety case as reductive constructions or epistemic oversimplifications. And they have a point. Predicting distant futures is an impossible task. However, as an anthropologist, I see my job as trying to peek inside my informants' worldviews and sort of critically apprehend their thinking's internal logics, no matter how irrational it may initially seem to me going in. Early on in this thought experiment, something became clear to me. Most of my informants, not all, pretty much agreed that their task was impossible ultimately. They had a subtle epistemic sensibility, a little more subtle than I'd been led to believe going in. They saw it as sort of obvious that their models are reductive, somewhat subjective, significantly mediated by history and culture, locked in the present moment. They saw their models of far future Finlands as highly sophisticated, educated guesses, the most credible forecast they could devise using the best science and technology available to them. My new book, Deep Time Reckoning, takes their pragmatic visions of the future seriously. Its goal is not to advocate for any naive realism or scientism or positivism in reckoning the far future. Everyone gasps when I say this. I don't really advocate for or against nuclear energy either. I don't have a view on that in the book. I simply argue that the safety case experts' mission of embarking on these distant future modeling projects in this self-reflective, self-aware spirit can inform our current moment of global ecological devastation. The question is how ethnographic methods can be used to mine safety case expertise for strategies that experts and publics alike can adopt to become more skilled deep time reckoners themselves. I call these strategies reckonings, and each chapter ends with 5 or 6 of them. They each offer takeaway guidance I leave behind each step of the way as I follow safety case experts ethnographically into far future Finlands. And cultivating this kind of societal time literacy, I argue, can help us resist 2 of today's most dismal global crises. The first is the Anthropocene. That's sort of an unofficial name proposed for a troubled epoch in Earth's history, ushered in by human transformations of our planet's climate, erosion patterns, extinctions, atmosphere, rock record, and more. This notion challenges entire populations to reimagine their ways of thinking, acting, and dwelling to better sync with our planet's radical long term, much like the geologist that Allison mentioned going in. The second crisis we're facing now creates new obstacles to this, however. In my book, I call it the deflation of expertise. Over the past few years in the United States, Western Europe, and beyond, political power is increasingly gained through nationalist populist mockery of expert virtues of meticulousness and cautious, careful speech. Vaccine science, stem cell research, climate change models, ballot counts, that was a good one recently, critical social theories, cell phone radiation studies, pandemic disease alerts, also relevant, and human evolution research have routinely been attacked in frenzied cable news free-for-alls and social media echo chambers mediated by algorithms that give you more of the same. What you click through, you get more of. Oxford English Dictionary named post-truth its 2016 word of the year, and alternative fact and fake news are now mainstream buzzwords. Over the past 2 weeks, President Trump, enabled by conservative pundits like Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity on Fox News, have sowed manipulative confusion about electoral fraud. It's pretty disturbing. In this setting, it strikes a slightly different chord when social theorists critique the hegemony of realism, truth, and facthood. These analytical strategies are increasingly used also to sow doubt and kind of deconstruct future-gazing climate change models and coronavirus epidemiological models, trying to sort of undercut their epistemic authority. So Foucauldian notions like power knowledge, right? They remain vital, but they just resonate a little differently now in this strange moment we're in. Today, political power is not always gained through alliance with technocratic knowledge, as Foucault put it, but through charismatic performative mockery of it to energize crowds. Expert voices are routinely drowned out by Twitter mobs. They're dulled by corporate knowledge management red tape. They're exhausted by adjunctification, short-term hiring trends at universities. They're warped by the contingent gig economy funding contracts that increasingly fund research with very strictly delineated horizons at which you have to submit things, affects the quality of research. And they're rushed by publisher-parish productivity pressures. As enthusiasm for liberal arts education and scientific inquiry deflates, societies enter into a state of futurelessness, my book argues, or futureless liminality. They develop this manic fixation on the present moment that incessantly shoots down proposals for envisioning better worlds. In the Anthropocene, looking Earth's radical long-term in the eye is a pressing societal imperative. We all have to do it. That's why I wrote Deep Time Reckoning in accessible prose. We live in times shaken by fractious social division and unraveling trust between experts and lay people. And the last thing we need is yet another alienating academic tome hiding its best ideas between impenetrable jargons. What's needed now are more stable bridges between the social and natural sciences, between experts and non-experts, and diverse cultures inhabiting a damaged planet that for many feels less and less like a friendly global village each day. So in this spirit, I ask, can collaborative engagement with safety case experts through ethnography help us resist this deflation of expertise, this post-truth moment? To answer this question, I've had to study 21st century Finland anthropologically. I had to examine which aspects of Finnish culture were laying groundwork for safety case experts to make these bold journeys across time without caving to onslaughts of public criticism like they did in other countries. So what did I find? Well, Finns from many walks of life describe their country's warmth to centralized hierarchical organizations and institutions like nuclear power plants, public transport systems, government ministries, and the welfare state. Some pointed to polls casting Finland as unique in the high level of trust in domestic civil servants. Bureaucrat or technocrat is a four-letter word in the US, where I'm from. In Finland, the civil servant is the most trusted role in society. They trust researchers, police, educators, pilots, and engineers statistically more than other countries. Others pointed to Finland's lack of historical experience with domestic technoscientific disasters like Bhopal or the BP oil spill. Finnish social scientists told me how Finland's trust in technology's ability to produce welfare, and the strong position of its administrative bodies, and the involvement of academic intellectuals kind of combined to create Finland's national ideology towards technology. Technocrats in Finland's Ministry of Employment and the Economy were among the most trusted figures in the country. Now, that's not to say there wasn't domestic critique or anti-nuclear activism. There certainly was. Some criticized Finland's icon of the virtually infallible engineer. Others criticized their compatriots for uncritically embracing Enlightenment scientism and the dictates of state authorities. Some hosted demonstrations like the Olkiluoto blockades, where activists blocked roads surrounding the Olkiluoto nuclear power plant in Western Finland, right near where this Onkalo repositories are. In 2010, Greenpeace placed a monument of selfishness in the Helsinki Park, listing the names of parliament members who recently voted for expanding Finland's nuclear capacity. In 1980, the Finnish rock band Eppu Normaali wrote an ironic song titled Suomi Ilmiö, or the Finnish syndrome, which criticized Finns' culture of uncritical nuclear trust, supposedly. That said, safety case work remained largely non-politicized. The not in my backyard politicking that stopped the US Yucca Mountain Repository project in its tracks in 2009 just wasn't strongly present in Finland as it was elsewhere. There was resistance to the new reactors that Hanhikivi 1 that Fennovoima is building, that they're buying reactor from Russia, and there was resistance to the huge delays in Olkiluoto 3 nuclear power plant, which has massive cost overruns and delays going in. So there was resistance to that, but the nuclear waste repository project was largely depoliticized. So there weren't these political stagnations over the decades like we saw in France, the UK, Canada, Germany, Switzerland, and elsewhere. This enabled Finland to hold closely to the repository construction schedule it set in the early 1980s and talk about Finnish punctuality. But let's not idealize Finnish expertise culture too much. A humanities colleague lamented how Finland's consensus valorizing debate culture made for kind of boring, non-adversarial talk radio. To her, this deterred healthy societal critique. A wisecracking Finnish social scientist once told me, quote, "In Finland, you get to observe a near total societal embrace of Foucauldian discipline and governmentality. And certain aspects of this deflating sense of expertise were alive in Finland too. Finland's Talvivaara mine wastewater leaks spread nickel, cadmium, zinc, uranium, and aluminum into eastern Finland's ecosystem since 2012. The high-profile criminal case that followed it caused many to wonder if Finland's extractive industry really worked in their interests. A scientist at the VTT Technical Research Center of Finland lamented how expertise there and across the West is increasingly diluted by the private interests of commercial and investment capital and workplace audits, incessant evaluations of research deliverables, quantity over quality. A scientist in Finland's geological survey complained how Finland's experts increasingly waste time doing paperwork, reporting to non-scientist managers rather than scientist or engineer managers like the old days, and applying for funding rather than doing actual research. That said, none of this compared to the maelstrom of discontent surrounding expert inquiry that I witnessed when I returned to the United States in August 2014. This reverse culture shock helped me put Finland's expertise politics into perspective. Coming home, your home society looks different, as did the society you just left. In time, I became increasingly optimistic that Finland's safety case experts' spirit of modesty, hard work, pragmatism, and self-reflection can offer some guidance, but not all the answers. With that in view, I now ask, can anthropological engagement with Finland's safety case experts help us widen our intellectual time horizons during this strange moment of ecological destruction that some call the Anthropocene? can taking their perspective seriously help us resist this deflating societal appreciation of various forms of expertise? Well, let's take an anthropological trip into Finland, far future Finlands, and try to find out. So what's the safety case? It details the Olkiluoto repository's technical design, it reports engineering principles and strategies, contains numerous interwoven quantitative models and qualitative scenarios forecasting this underground repository's fate over the coming millennia. In my book, I explore, for example, how safety case biosphere assessment modelers simulated Western Finland's lakes, rivers, mires, and forests sprouting up, disappearing, and changing shape and size over the next 10 millennia. The experts considered far future soil erosion, floods, and fires. They envisioned a 3-kilometer thick glacial ice sheet during the next ice age, slated to occur 50 or 60,000 years from now. They envisioned potential seismic events, like earthquakes or rock shears, that could occur as the ice sheet retreats after the next ice age. They modeled how the current Olkiluoto Island site will eventually become an inland site. In their models, glacial rebound from the last ice age eventually causes Finland's shoreline to widen further out into the Baltic Sea and sort of engulfs Olkiluoto Island, where they're bearing the waste, into Finland's mainland. They also explored more pessimistic and unlikely scenarios. This included models of how 14 different kinds of radionuclides could conceivably escape from the repository's engineered barriers, travel through groundwater flows and underground rock fractures, and get released at various points on Earth's surface, and then disperse in above ground ecosystems in Western Finland, bioaccumulating at times in plants and animals along the way. I explore safety case biosphere assessors' conservative assumption that 6,000 far future people, all eating local food, will live in Western Finland. My informants' models suggest that some of them, a critical group, may face a greater likelihood of exposure due to unlucky food selection. And I note how the safety case argues that all of these hypothetical future people would be safely below Stuke's stringent regulatory dose limits, even under these very unlikely circumstances. That is the rhetorical structure of this piece of evidence that they're creating. So remember, the safety case is an artifact of regulatory science, right? So its goal is to persuade, and it has an agenda to convince the regulator that the repository is safe. So these are Promethean labors, to say the least. However, reckoning with deep time also requires a level of humility. Some safety case experts I met integrated self-critique, reflexivity, and admissions of vast uncertainty into their own models and reports. They did so using methods with names like knowledge quality assessment and sensitivity analysis. This meant admitting to and then systematically detailing all the different reductive assumptions found in their knowledge base, the epistemic oversimplifications, rather than trying to conceal them. Admit to them in the text. The safety case did not put forth one single overconfident model assumed to perfectly represent the far future, though there was a performance assessment, which was kind of the primary forecast of what the world may be like in the future. It also forecasted a multiplicitous series of projections about potential future events, each weighted with different likelihoods of occurring. So some put forth these base or most likely scenarios, then there's variant or reasonably likely scenarios, or disturbance, which are quite unlikely scenarios. Other terminologies were used too. Some put forth these reference cases, which are the most likely scenario, sensitivity cases, which are scenarios that include some negative future variant events occurring over time, and then what if cases, these really unlikely worst case scenarios to see what kind of the limit cases for what could possibly go wrong. As my informants saw it, these multiple parallel visions of tomorrow can tell us something, but surely not everything about far future Finlands. And in my book, I suggest that this kind of multi-temporal, multi-timescale, multi-perspective sensibility can be helpful to us as we try to combat the problems of the Anthropocene and the deflation of expertise. So that forms the basis of many of my end of the chapter reckonings that I mentioned. So one reckoning is about envisioning what safety case experts called multiple lines of evolution. This means venturing several multi-pronged visions of future potential worlds, always in the plural. A second reckoning is about self-critique that doesn't paralyze action. Cautiously applying scientific rationality to far futures can add some structure to one's thoughts. It can help overcome the feelings of meaninglessness, mystery, terror, anxiety, overwhelming complexity that well up when we gaze into deep time's abyss. But we can never trick ourselves into thinking these are perfect representations of the future, or that our work is ever complete. They used a stepwise approach of progressively developing new and improved updated versions of the safety case that ideally grow more robust as the years go on. They call these successive versions of the safety case iterations. Each iteration is seen as kind of a work in progress. New iterations are to be released every 10 or 15 years until the Oak Hill Repository's planned decommissioning in the year 2120. That's a long project. The next safety case iteration will be Posiva's operating license application, which is scheduled for submission late next year. And that's for when it starts accepting waste. Gets government permission for that. So anyway, a third reckoning is about what my informants called multiple lines of reasoning. This means convening several different teams of experts, each with different disciplinary backgrounds. The safety case is what philosopher Adrian Curie calls methodologically omnivorous. If readers don't trust its quantitative models, far future ecosystems, or hydrogeology, they can instead turn to its defense of the repository's engineered barrier system, or they can turn to engineering reports on the mechanical strength test done on its copper nuclear waste canisters. If they don't trust those reports, they can instead turn to the qualitative scenarios which detail potential far future Finlands in prose. This is an approach of strategic redundancy. It integrates the logics of many different fields to ensure that one potentially inaccurate disciplinary assumption doesn't really invalidate the wider range of projections. I'll say something about the future, but none tell the whole story. It's a very partial way of looking at the future from each angle. So to me, this is a multi-perspectival form of interdisciplinarity, and it's a refreshing counterpoint to the kind of myopic reductionist scientism that produced many of the intractable problems we're seeing with the Anthropocene. So let's take a look at yet another line of reasoning in the safety case. My informants also used qualitative analogical techniques to help forecast their repository's far future. They studied a glacial ice sheet near Kongerlussuaq in Greenland as an analog, a present-day stand-in feature used for the sake of comparison. They used it to make inferences about the fate of a future glacial ice sheet during and after the next ice age. They pointed to a Mesozoic copper deposit as well, which was preserved for 170 million years without succumbing to major corrosion. This is encased in mudstone in Devon, England. This became an analog for how the repository's copper nuclear waste canisters will fare in the future. Then they studied Lake Lapajärvi. That's a crater lake that resulted from a meteor crashing into Finland 73 million years ago. They approached it as an analog for how Finland's landscape could change over the next several ice ages. Yet my informants didn't apply analogical reasoning to geophysical features alone. This is where the anthropologists are getting interested. They also developed what they called archaeological analogs. They pointed to a 2,100-year-old human cadaver found in China, surrounded by clay and discovered alongside wood, vegetables, silk, and meat. They were interested in the clay's capacity to preserve the body and the artifacts. They reported the body to be well preserved, its abdominal organs were intact, and its skin was completely there. Some of its joints are still movable without it ever being mummified. The vegetables and meat were only partially decomposed, and the clay had made an airtight seal around them. The safety case experts recast the cadaver and the artifacts as analogs for how bentonite clay might preserve nuclear waste canisters over thousands of years. They studied a bronze cannon from the shipwrecked 17th century warship Kronen, which was submerged for almost 3 centuries in Baltic seawater and seabed. Cannon became an analog for how Finland's and Sweden's copper nuclear waste canisters will or will not corrode in the far future. They studied 2,000-year-old Roman nails that were dug up in Scotland as analogs for determining whether nuclear waste canisters' cast iron components, the cast iron inserts into which they put the spent nuclear fuel bundles, will corrode in the future. Now, during my fieldwork, I found myself following these analogies widely across time, however imperfect they may be. So in my book, I chronicle this analogical journey. I take pit stops in the Roman Empire, in a future Earth that looks like Mars, in Gabon during our planet's earliest history, and other planets. There's Martian analogs, in ancient China, in regions of South Africa in the year 2030, West Virginia during World War II and beyond. I do this by comparing these nuclear waste analog studies to various climate analog studies and space analog studies, which are analogous kinds of studies, if you will, that NASA has conducted in the US, where I'm from. And I read about the limitations too. There are huge limits to what, say, a bronze cannon submerged in the sea for centuries can really tell us about a copper nuclear waste canister buried in granite bedrock for millennia. There are huge limits to what a native copper found in mud rock in Devon can really tell us about manufactured copper canisters found in clay in Olkiluoto. They're not copies of each other, they're analogs. Indeed, many saw differences between repository components and their analogs as simply too vast to make analogical connections between them. One informant noted how the safety case experts tended to cherry pick analog studies to support their own arguments. And it's true. My informants didn't spend much time scouring the globe for counterexamples that could call Postdoctoral's repository concept into question. The safety case's goal was explicitly to persuade. That said, I suggest we adopt the self-reflective, multi-perspectival, multidisciplinary sensibility I kind of appropriated from my informants, and that I lay out in my previous set of reckonings that I talked about in relation to the models. From this angle, analogs still have something to teach us, even if they never offer us anything closely resembling certainty. It always has to be a contextual, situated, partial type of knowledge. What they do offer is an empirical concreteness, right? And a materiality that's more tangible than empty speculation and the epistemic hyperconstructions of models. Inspired by nuclear waste analogs, but keeping their limitations in view, my book starts at kind of the endpoints of my informant's knowledge and then stretches them further to produce even more reckonings at the end of my chapter. They ask, can integrating far-sighted flights of analogy like these into our day-to-day ponderings help us sharpen our deep time reckoning skills? Can doing routine intellectual exercises, comparing these different objects across time and space, help us reflect on possible similarities and differences between past, future, and present-day worlds? To what extent can these analogs help us envision what our home regions, for example, might look like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of years from now? To ask these questions is to approach analog studies in what historian Gabrielle Hecht calls, what she calls, interscalar vehicles. These are objects that can sort of draw us to move intellectually through deep time and human time, and ethnographically, and through geological space and political space. You can follow the analogies. Hecht's concept helped me revisit the safety case analogs as a means for connecting all these different stories and timescales and places that are usually kept apart. And I didn't have to travel very far from my previous workplace, George Washington University in Washington, DC, to begin following objects analogically across time in a similar spirit. In 1922, for example, excavators cleared ground for building the nearby Mayflower Hotel in DC, and when they did, they found fossilized bald cypress trees 20 feet below the surface. These trees lived to be about 1,700 years old, and they grew roughly 100,000 years ago. Back then, America's capital city was a literal swamp. Today, 4 bald cypress trees planted in the mid-1800s grow in Lafayette Square, right near the White House, a few blocks from where I work. When I walked by them, the trees, by borrowing some analogical techniques from my informants, became interscalar vehicles. They became empirical material imaginative resources I could draw upon to help me think about my surroundings more widely across time. They provided me with some ancient tree imageries I could envision when reimagining the nation's capital analogically as a prehistoric marsh. In my book, my reckonings challenge readers to do something similar. Taking cues from safety case analog studies, I suggest we ask questions like these. If climate scientists forecast my current place of residence to someday have a desert ecosystem, to what extent can I draw on these mental imageries I already have of, say, Arizona's deserts, to imagine the area with a different ecosystem or devoid of the kind of life we see in its current ecosystem? If my current city is forecasted to look something like Ice Age Finland, well, maybe I could draw upon what my informants told me about Greenland's Kongerlussuaq ice sheet to help picture what that looks like. To what extent can I do this, though? Using online tools like CGIAR's Climate Analogs application can also help kind of refine and gain information about the future of one's region, right? It's an app that kind of helps compare the future climate of your own region to analogous regions' climates elsewhere, right? So that can sort of add another line of reasoning when we think. So when we add new analogs and trajectories to our inventories of ways of thinking about the future, we not only get better at making these good analogies across time, we also get better at breaking bad analogies. So pondering this, I suggest that safety case analogs can inspire something like a long-termist intellectual workout or calisthenics for the mind, or kind of like a thought experiments that one can do to get more comfortable thinking like a nuclear waste expert or a geologist. This means doing routine intellectual workouts, asking ourselves, at what point do the dissimilarities between the two objects in a long-term analogy become so pronounced that they kind of break the analogical tie that's been connected between them? At what point do they no longer shed meaningful light on one another? When do they become so different or so far across time that they break down? What degree of sameness and what kind of sameness must exist between the two objects being compared in order to make an analogical connection between them across long-term timescales? Even if an analogy is imperfect, I argue it can still add some value. At least some useful information can be extracted from the imperfect analogies, helping us refine how we envision potential futures, always in the plural, and always partial and situated and contextualized, as the Anthropocene takes hold. So my fieldwork among safety case experts showed me how this can outfit us with kind of an evidence-driven toolkit that's more tangible than navel-gazing speculation, but never offers all the answers. If entire populations were to develop these Anthropocene skill sets, well, maybe a broader temporal transformation in how people look at the future could take place. Turning to long-sighted experts like those that developed analog studies can help us resist the deflating expertise we're seeing and the shallow time horizons that it sort of entraps us in. But remember, deep time reckoning is at its core a work of anthropology. As such, it introduces several safety case experts to the reader in person. I've given them all pseudonyms. There's Risto, Laura, Taimi, Juha, Anders, Oppo, and Gustav. And most of the book's reckonings are positive. However, some are cautionary tales. The last chapter explores how the safety case was thrown off course for months in 2005, when a prolific but abrasive key expert died unexpectedly. To protect his identity, I renamed him Seppo. During fieldwork, I tracked how safety case experts kind of summoned or conjured or referenced Seppo, whose specter was said to haunt their scientific community. I kept seeing those kind of metaphors and analogies. So for some, the afterlives of Seppo's expertise manifested as the kind of gaps in knowledge that were left behind by this deceased expert who was reluctant to document how he did his modeling work. For others, they manifested as anecdotes about Seppo's stubbornness or irritability or intellectual intensity, as well as his more jovial, fun demeanor during sauna nights or workplace parties, or the trips, many vacations and trips he took abroad, or trips to conferences. Still others caught themselves asking, what would Seppo do while troubleshooting at work? This reminds us how challenging it could be to build intellectual infrastructures that outlast any particular lifespan. So I hope the reckonings I've gleaned from Seppo's tragic situation can help us work towards building more long-sighted societies. So each reckoning at the end of that chapter offers ideas for embracing an ethic of predecessor preservation or succession stewardship, right? So this means carefully tending to and disseminating these insights from particularly prolific deep time reckoners, so their contributions to long-termism in general across humanity don't die off upon their biological deaths, like in this case. Some was retained and some was lost. This can inch us toward resisting our current intellectual, political, and ecological crises. And unfortunately, in the United States anyway, where I just moved from, these crises are pretty grave. Earlier this year, the Trump administration advanced a proposal to reform key National Environmental Policy Act regulations to read, quote, Effects should not be considered significant if they are remote in time, geographically remote, or the product of a lengthy causal chain. These conditions make Seppo's and other safety case experts' efforts to protect distant future worlds seem truly alien. Now, of course, we can find some hope in Joe Biden's electoral successes. In his victory speech, he promised to marshal the forces of science. He described the election as a great day for American educators, referencing his educator wife, Jill Biden, the First Lady, soon to be First Lady. He promised to found a COVID team committed to, quote, bedrock science. However, Trump, his family, his personal lawyer, his political and media allies will remain influential public voices and cultural forces among the 72 million or so people who voted for him. And if this could become worse if there's some sort of Trump TV media empire set up too. So a change in presidential administration will do precious little to help societies escape from our toxic attentional economy immediately, so it won't hurt. It won't reduce and when I say attentional economy, I'm referring to, if anyone's seen that documentary, Social Dilemma, that just came out. So it won't reduce the deeper fixation, right, on knee-jerk social media culture wars, these frenzied 24-hour cable news cycles, these short-sighted productivity metrics I described, and these unpredictable shifts in shareholder returns to which everyone's attuned. There's a deeper political economic substructure behind all of this. So my hope is that deep time reckoning can help in a very tiny, modest way, at least, to escape the shallow time discipline, as I call it in my book, that's imposed by this deflating sense of expertise, by the Anthropocene concept, and the future of cultural Trumpism. Anthropocene is an interesting way to frame it. It's not officially on the geologic timetable yet, but it's being vetted for potentially becoming official. So we need to overcome these forces more completely lest we succumb to our planet's current ecological death spiral. So that's kind of a sample of my book's content and its overall vibe. And there's a lot more in there. There's a few chapters I didn't mention, but thank you for listening, and I'll turn it back over to Allison to moderate the Q&A. And I really look forward to any and all questions, and thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, thanks, Vinny. That was great. Let me remind you all to put your questions in the Q&A so I can see them and pass them along to Vincent. I'm gonna just start off by just pointing out that what's fascinating about this and all the in the safety case modeling and scenario planning that was done in Finland, it's all looking to the far future, but and a lot of the people doing it are geologists,
right,
and they are trained in a science that is a retrodictive science. So geology just explains the past. It doesn't predict the future, right, in fact. And in trying to explain the past, the Earth has looked really different from how it does now, right, in the past. And so it's a matter of being able to escape from our lived reality, and the idea that the mountain is always there, you know, and move beyond that to imagining something very different. So I think it's great that you have pulled this all together and sort of highlighted some of this. I'm interested in how the safety case planners interacted with the public and addressed some of the public concerns that came up and how those concerns may or may not have been incorporated. So if you say something a little bit about that quickly, then I'll move on to the questions.
How they interacted with the public. Well, the Finland's approach to licensing a repository is structured a little differently than it was in the US. In the US, you had the Screw Nevada bill in 1987 is, they shove it in the backyard of the state, which has a small amount of electoral votes and not too much political power at the time until Harry Reid climbs the ladder and things change. They put it in the backyard of indigenous communities and places that have been nuclear bombed several hundred times, Nevada test site, right? They put it in this highly politically contentious place. There's a huge decide, announce, defend approach. Now things are changing. People are looking at consent-based siting and other more, I think, participatory and enlightened perspectives. Finland approached the whole task a little differently, right? So first they did studies all around Finland and then whittled down to a small number, a handful of potential repository sites. Some of the early studies kind of came to saying that Finland's bedrock is relatively uniform. The fractures are different across the place, so there's not a huge difference between places to put it. So let's put it in one of Loviisa, where there's already community interest and nuclear facilities. So they do that, but then they do an environmental impact assessment phase. And in this phase, they give a local municipal veto to the community, which is pretty rare. So they actually had to kind of court the community, do all these hearings, do all these participatory rituals in the public. And they actually took questions that people were asking and then actually looked into them. People ask questions, okay, let's do a project on that. And then they come back. So the questions from the public are like actually integrated into the substance of the environmental impact statement. This is actually before any of the safety case work gets done. So this is done in the early 2000s, this whole procedure. They get the community approval, it goes on, it gets parliamentary approval, the decision in principle is made. And that's kind of the normative, political, ethical, moral question of should we build a repository here? Do the community people consent? After that, the safety case becomes more of a technocratic endeavor. It's really the safety case is really between Posiva, the implementer, which is owned by Teolle Sydänvoima, a nuclear company, and Fortum, the nuclear company in Finland, and STUK, the nuclear regulatory authority of Finland, and the Ministry of Employment and Economy, under which the entire nuclear complex in Finland is kind of housed governmentally. So safety case didn't engage that much with the public. However, things like analogs and this complementary considerations report they created were intentionally made in a way that's accessible to publics that you don't see in other license applications for different, say, the huge hyper complex black box license application performances, total system performance assessment model for the Yucca Mountain project. So there's also a report called the synthesis report that kind of summarized the safety case. So they did an extra step to make this more accessible to a wider range of stakeholders. So there's analogs for the geologists and the anthropologists, and then there's models for the mathematicians, and there's, engineered studies, stress tests for the engineers. So it was written in a genre that's more accessible, but at this point, it's mostly a technocratic flavor because they got, during the decision in principle phase in about 2000, it's mostly out of the way. What I studied was the decision, do we allow this repository to be constructed? Construction license application, 2015, STUK and the Ministry of Employment and Economy say yes. And then next year, the question will be operating license. Can they actually start taking the spent nuclear fuel bundles and then putting them in the repository chartered by Clay? Mostly technocratic at this point, but there are hearings and public communications too.
Great. All right, let me turn to some of the questions. First question was about, is there a plan to make the waste retrievable in Finland?
This is kind of an interesting, this is an interesting thing. So some people said yes, and some people said no. There was disagreements about how robust the actual plan to retrieve waste is. Most people, when I was there from 2000, you can write reports saying that this is retrievable in a certain way, but retrievability isn't fundamentally built into the KBS3 repository concept as it existed in Finland as I understood it when I was immersed among these people, did my 120 interviews. The idea was to basically take the spent fuel bundles, put them in cast iron inserts, surround them by, put them in copper capsules, weld them shut, put them in deposition holes, surround them by bentonite clay that absorbs the local groundwater, cap it, backfill the repository, and then around the year 2120, kind of leave it and forget about it, and not mark it with all the sort of passive institutional controls and sort of the strange architectural signs that they're putting in front of WIP. So that seemed to be the main thrust of how this could happen. Is it possible that they could retrieve it? Well, who knows what technology in the future will be like. But overall, it seemed to be, we've decided we're going to bury it, then we're going to cap it off, we're going to forget, and we're not going to hire the semioticians and science fiction authors and material scientists and all the folks that were hired, like Gregory Benford and all these folks in the United States. They created this free state of Chihuahua scenario, trying to imagine post-sovereignty US and things like that. They didn't, a lot of them seemed as kind of hubristic to decide on that. So pretty much it's complicated, but I would say overall, most people thought that this is the final disposal.
Okay. All right. And the next question, the listener wants to hear more of your thoughts on the current pandemic short-sightedness,
Right.
Anthropocene short-sightedness in the book, in combination with the deflation of expertise thinking, mainly about governments not following epidemiologists' guidance regards to the pandemic. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about the reckonings associated with this.
Right. So the first thing I'll say is the pandemic is intersecting with nuclear waste in a fascinating way currently as we speak. There's currently an outbreak in the WIPP nuclear waste repository in Carlsbad, New Mexico. I'm doing a new project there. There's limited airflow down there. It's like a mine, right? And there's small amounts of people stuck in there. It's the ultimate indoor site, is a nuclear waste repository. So there is an outbreak and dozens of people who work there are getting it. So it's kind of an interesting thing, like, right? You create these performance assessments that promise 10,000 years of safety. And in a sense they do and will. But then you have an accident like in 2014, this wrong type of kitty litter was put in a drum as an absorbent, then there's an explosion, shuts down the repository for 35 months. And basically they got 14 and a half years of safety rather than 10,000 years of safety. But then that's an operational phase thing, it's different. COVID just came out of nowhere. No one anticipated COVID during the safety assessment model. So it shows how little we know about the future, I guess, as well. How that relates to the deflation of expertise, well, it's kind of interesting because a lot of social scientists are kind of quick to point to previous generations and previous contexts. It made a lot more sense when there was a vast societal trust in this huge national security apparatus that was kind of justifying its own existence in the US, building nuclear weapons by pointing to its own hyper-rationality, right? So in that context, a lot of social scientists kind of tried to undercut the plausibility of models, nuclear waste models. Now we're in kind of a different place. A lot of those, if you go on like Breitbart or Quillette and all these conservative outlets, you see similar strategies being applied to different types of models, like coronavirus models and things like that. You start to wonder, did we invent that? Did we cause people to have this epistemic problem that we're seeing right now? I mean, how much of this is from constructivism or deconstruction and things like that? I don't think a huge amount, but some of it's there. So it's a really thorny thing. Something was interesting. I heard a talk the other day about saying that journalistic objectivity is at the New York Times is the view from nowhere, and it's like this master discourse that presents it as if it's universalizing and unequivocally true at all different times. But the thing is, in 2020, do people really think things like that? Well, on the political left, they say, no, the New York Times and the way they report on coronavirus, that's a bunch of predominantly white institution, huge diversity problem at the New York Times. It's not the view from nowhere, it's a view from a very particular place. On the political right, you have people saying, these are all coastal elites, right? Reporting on coronavirus. So, I mean, everyone kind of situates things a little more in this context and kind of rips them apart on social media. So there's this radically diffracted sense of what coronavirus is, how it intersects with the long term, how it intersects with media discourses, how it intersects with different epistemic sensibilities. And I worry that it's being atomized in incredible amounts of different ways in different people. So what coronavirus means and what the future of coronavirus means differs between you and your neighbor, the guy down the street, and the person at the New York Times, and the person at the WIPP repository who just got COVID, and the Finnish nuclear regulator. This radical fragmentation of perspectives is something that I'd be concerned about. And it's the problem with COVID, it's the problem with imagining climate futures too.
Great. So you have a whole lot of questions, but unfortunately we're almost out of time. So I am going to just pass on one more question, and then we have to wrap up because we have to finish at 1:30. So the question is this: as an anthropologist, I'm sure you're very aware there are many different modes for engaging with the far futures and long time spans: religious, aesthetic, and poetic modes, indigenous worldviews, and more. But I wonder to what extent scientific expert culture is receptive to these. Even though some parts of expert culture have been challenged, it retains a lot of authority which marginalizes other ways of thinking and sensing that block our imagining of the future.
Yes.
And you have 3 minutes.
Okay, that's a huge order. All right. Yeah, I mean, I essentially agree. I mean, that's why I repeatedly, over and over again, stressed in my talk that this is a situated perspective. It's a view from somewhere. It's a view from a bunch of Finns, mostly Finns, somewhere from Spain or Italy or Sweden, who had training in a very specific amount of expertise. They went to usually a similar array of schools. There's the Lappeenranta University of Technology, and there's Aalto University, used to be Helsinki University of Technology. They know each other, and there's a tiny little circuit, and they're creating a vision of the far future while sort of qualifying what they're saying by saying, look, we're going to have other iterations of this in the future. We're going to try to make it better. Was this incompatible with sort of the epistemology or ontology of, say, of an indigenous perspective or a religious perspective? Absolutely. But does that mean that the two can't coexist next to each other and mutually inform each other and fill each other's gaps along multiple lines of reasoning? I think there's more hope for that than is commonly accepted. So I personally didn't see, when I was doing interviews, people saying like an indigenous way of looking at the world, or from, even though there's so many different indigenous ways of looking at the world, or a religious way of looking at the world is bogus. I've never heard any of that. In fact, one of my informants' daughters was getting an archaeology degree. They talked about it all the time. Another one, just when I interviewed her, all she did was talk about how she's read 1 million books on Native Americans. I mean, they're experts, right? So they read about these things and kind of take an interest in them. Does it make its way into the safety case? No, it does not. Should it? I don't know. Perhaps the future will decide future iterations.
Okay, great. Thank you. Perfect timing.
Right.
Okay, well, I'm glad that there's been so much interest in the topic. It's, I think, a very important one, but of course I'm a little biased. And I appreciate your discussion on this and your attention to this. So hopefully people can follow up with their questions with you outside of our little Zoom room here. But thanks a lot, Vincent. And thank you all for joining us.
All right, thank you. This is great.